Autumn 1945. A quiet California morning settles over the barbed wire fences of a Japanese POW camp near Stockton. The war is over, though the men inside still struggle to believe it. They stand in neat lines, shovels and rakes in hand, performing the morning chores that give their days rhythm. Beyond the fence, the air smells faintly of wet earth and oranges from a nearby grove. Then, through the stillness, laughter drifts across the yard. A group of American children run along the outer road, 3 boys and a girl, chasing a paper airplane that dips and loops above the wire. Their mothers call after them, unafraid, smiling. The prisoners stop working. One man, a former sergeant from Nagasaki, watches in silence as the children tumble onto the grass, unguarded, joyous. For a moment, he forgets where he is. He thinks of his own son, whom he left in 1943, taught to bow before portraits and march in silence. These children bow to no one. Their laughter feels dangerous, impossible, and pure. He whispers almost to himself, "Korigajiyuka? This is freedom?" No one answers. The question hangs in the air, heavier than the wire itself. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the empire that had demanded death before capture found itself faced with tens of thousands of prisoners who had lived to see the war's end. Their mere survival defied everything they had been taught. For decades, the Imperial Army had branded surrender as the ultimate shame. Soldiers were told that to fall into enemy hands was to forfeit their honor, their family, and their name. Captivity was worse than death. It was erasure. Yet by the war's closing months, thousands of Japanese soldiers had done the unthinkable. On Okinawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and in scattered island garrisons across the Pacific, wounded, starving men laid down their arms. Some were captured unconscious. Others simply walked out of caves after hearing the emperor's voice announce surrender. They expected execution. Instead, they found bandages, food, and the bewildering kindness of their enemies. For the U.S. military, the capture of Japanese soldiers posed a new kind of challenge. Unlike German POWs who were accustomed to the conventions of Western warfare, Japanese prisoners were haunted by indoctrination. They feared torture, mutilation, or death at every turn. Many refused to eat at first, believing their rations poisoned. Some attempted suicide when approached by medics. The American guards learned quickly that compassion, not force, was the only language that worked. By the end of 1945, roughly 6,000 Japanese prisoners had been transported to the continental United States, joining more than 20,000 others held in Guam, Hawaii, and other Pacific territories. They were scattered among established German POW installations, often in segregated compounds. The largest mainland sites at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Kennedy in Texas, and Stockton in California followed the strict standards of the Geneva Convention: medical care, education, fair rations, and opportunities for labor. When the first prisoners arrived, gaunt and silent, the guards were struck by their discipline. They bowed upon command, spoke little, and moved in rigid lines. The idea that they were to be treated humanely bewildered them. An Army chaplain stationed at Camp McCoy wrote, "They expect cruelty. When we give them coffee, they think it's a trick." Slowly, through daily routines, trust replaced terror. Meals became the first shock. American rations, fresh bread, fruit, and meat, stood in stark contrast to the meager rice and seaweed the men had known in the field. Prisoners ate cautiously at first, glancing toward their guards for cues. But when no punishment followed, they began to eat freely. A sergeant from the Imperial Navy later said, "It was the first time I had eaten without fear." Still, the psychological distance between captor and captive remained vast. The Japanese soldiers had grown up in a world where authority was absolute and individuality dangerous. Their days began and ended with obedience. Freedom, as the Americans lived it, was something they had never truly seen, an invisible rhythm in how people spoke, laughed, and disagreed. It was within this cultural chasm that the most profound transformations began. U.S. officials didn't seek to humiliate the prisoners, they sought to rehabilitate them. Educational officers introduced classes in English, geography, and democratic civics, hoping to prepare the men for Japan's post-war future. Chaplains offered optional moral discussions. For many prisoners, the concept of open debate, of questioning authority without punishment, was as shocking as the food on their plates. Even within the fences, glimpses of the outside world intrigued them. Camp Stockton sat only a few miles from a small town, where civilian life continued as if the war had never reached its borders. Local farmers passed by in trucks. Children rode bicycles, and American flags fluttered on porches. To the prisoners, these scenes were surreal, a world untouched by air raids, where laughter wasn't rationed. In one report filed by the camp's commanding officer, a simple observation stood out. Their greatest astonishment is not our power, but our calm. The men who had been trained to see Americans as barbaric conquerors now saw something harder to define: ordinary people living without fear. It was this quiet normalcy, not military might, that began to break the spell of indoctrination. Life inside America's Japanese POW camps was built on routine, restraint, and unexpected calm. By late 1945, war's chaos had been replaced by an ordered peace. The camps, ringed by barbed wire but lined with flower beds, basketball courts, and laundry lines, stood as paradoxes of captivity and decency. Guards woke the men at dawn, roll call followed, then came work details, classes, or recreation. Each day unfolded with military precision, but beneath that order, something subtler was happening. The prisoners were being quietly reintroduced to humanity. Most of these camps were located near small communities: Fresno, Stockton, Honolulu, and in scattered compounds across Guam and Hawaii. Their proximity to civilian life created accidental windows between two worlds. Children could be heard laughing at nearby schools. Women hung laundry on lines that stretched within view of the fences. For men who had been told that American life was chaotic and immoral, the simple rhythm of those scenes felt surreal. The first time Japanese prisoners saw American families picnicking near camp boundaries, they assumed it was propaganda. They expected hidden guards, orchestrated smiles. But the laughter was unplanned, unperformed. It carried a freedom that no empire could manufacture. To them, it sounded like peace itself. The camps were designed not merely to detain, but to reorient. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division saw in these prisoners an opportunity. If treated fairly, they could return home as examples of post-war cooperation rather than hatred. So the prisoners were given access to reading materials, language courses, and even films, carefully chosen documentaries and newsreels showing daily life in America. The images of supermarkets, schools, and public elections left them stunned. "We did not believe such places existed," one officer later said. "We were told Americans were ruled by violence. Instead, they are ruled by choice." The food remained the most persistent revelation. 3 meals a day, balanced and generous. At Camp McCoy, inspectors noted that Japanese prisoners consumed more meat and milk than the average Japanese civilian back home. The guards enforced dietary equality. Prisoners ate exactly what American soldiers did. Many of the men, malnourished after years of jungle warfare, regained weight and health within months. Some wept openly when first served white rice, unable to understand why their conquerors would give them the very luxury their empire could not. Over time, barriers softened. Guards began to see the prisoners less as enemies and more as men, disciplined, proud, but fundamentally human. Prisoners reciprocated with politeness, bowing during roll calls, maintaining immaculate barracks, and sending letters of gratitude through the Red Cross. They remained deeply formal, often requesting permission even to smile in photographs. But behind that rigid exterior, their sense of the world was shifting. Camp Stockton became particularly well documented because of its proximity to civilian neighborhoods. The fence line bordered a dirt road that led to a nearby elementary school. In the afternoons, when classes ended, children often ran past the camp on their way home. Sometimes they waved. At first, the guards shouted for them to stay clear, but the gestures continued. Brief, innocent exchanges between those who had never known each other's fear. It was through those unguarded glimpses, children playing baseball, mothers pushing strollers, farmers hauling produce, that many Japanese POWs experienced their first real understanding of freedom. They saw laughter that required no permission, affection that required no ritual, and daily life untouched by the paranoia of a police state. In post-war interviews, several former prisoners recalled these scenes as turning points. One said, "We had believed that America was a land of monsters. Then we saw their children, and the illusion collapsed." Another remembered thinking, "If this is what they fight for, perhaps we misunderstood everything." In the reports sent to Washington, camp commanders noted that the prisoners' morale improved most not from rations or rest, but from observation of normal civilian life. It was as though the sight of peace itself had become medicine. By late 1946, the Japanese POW camps were not merely holding grounds, they had become classrooms of civility. Behind barbed wire, a quiet lesson was being learned, that freedom was not chaos, but order without fear. And every afternoon, the sound of children's laughter beyond the fence became the clearest definition of it. Shame, awakening, and tears. For the Japanese prisoners, captivity in America was not just physical, it was spiritual. The first weeks behind wire were marked by silence and shame. They believed they had failed the emperor, their families, and themselves. Many refused to look at their guards or speak above a whisper. In their culture, defeat was total, and survival itself felt dishonorable. But then, gradually, they began to encounter small acts of humanity that unraveled that darkness. A guard offered a cigarette. A nurse changed a bandage with care. A chaplain smiled without mockery. These moments did not erase shame, but they began to redefine it. The prisoners realized they were not despised. They were being treated as men. That realization hurt and healed in equal measure. When they first saw American children playing outside the camp fences, laughter ringing in the air, something inside many of them broke open. They had been taught that the enemy was decadent, corrupt, godless. Yet here was innocence without fear. The contrast was unbearable. "We wept," one recalled decades later, "because we saw what we had destroyed in our own hearts." Another said their laughter sounded like forgiveness. That sound, the unrestrained joy of children, became an emotional mirror. For men who had only known discipline, it was both painful and liberating. They began to talk quietly at night about home, about their own children, about what kind of world they wanted to rebuild if they ever returned. The wire between captivity and conscience grew thinner with each passing day. When discipline met democracy. Japanese society before and during the war was governed by hierarchy. Loyalty ran upward, never outward. Obedience was sacred. Questioning authority was treasonous. In contrast, the world inside and around American camps operated on a rhythm the prisoners had never seen. Rules enforced with calm, leadership exercised without shouting, and freedom balanced by respect. Guards called each other by name, not rank. Commanders gave orders without striking fear. Work details ran on cooperation, not coercion. The Japanese prisoners observed this in stunned silence. Their entire world view, rooted in the idea that only rigid control could maintain order, was being dismantled by the quiet efficiency of democracy in action. The most shocking moment came when they learned that their guards, though armed, could joke with superiors or question decisions respectfully. "They argue with officers," one POW wrote in a letter, "and yet they are not punished. I thought this was anarchy. But it is something else. It is dignity." This ideological awakening went deeper than admiration. It sparked introspection. If an enemy could create harmony without terror, what had Japan truly fought for? For some, that question became unbearable. For others, it became the beginning of liberation. They started to understand that freedom was not lawlessness, it was responsibility shared equally. The bridge of ordinary kindness, the daily interactions between Japanese prisoners and Americans, guards, cooks, farmers, and sometimes even children, became the real bridge between two civilizations. There were rules against fraternization, but kindness found its way through anyway. When American workers repaired camp fencing, they left extra nails and wood for the prisoners' craft projects. A nurse slipped a folded newspaper to a man eager to read about the end of the war. Children tossed baseballs over the wire and waited for them to be thrown back. Those exchanges transformed the atmosphere. The camps, once echoing with the weight of shame, grew quieter, almost reflective. The prisoners began tending gardens, carving wooden toys, and painting landscapes from memory. Some presented these carvings to the guards as gifts when they were transferred out. The pieces often depicted scenes of peace: mountains, rivers, cherry blossoms. The guards, in turn, began to see the prisoners not as faceless soldiers, but as men of discipline and pride, now struggling to understand a world without orders. One corporal wrote to his wife, "They bow every morning, and yet they look at us differently now, not with fear, with curiosity." That curiosity became contagious. Some guards taught English phrases, some prisoners taught calligraphy. By the time Red Cross inspectors arrived, many camps resembled strange, functioning communities where decency had replaced suspicion. And always, in the background, came the sound of laughter from beyond the wire. The children who knew nothing of war, who unknowingly reminded everyone inside what peace truly meant. For the prisoners, it was both torment and salvation. They realized they were hearing the one thing Japan's militarism had stolen from them: innocence. That realization would become the seed of transformation that carried them back across the ocean and into a different Japan. Healing through observation. For many Japanese POWs, recovery began not through therapy or ideology, but through observation. They watched, listened, and slowly unlearned fear. American guards never shouted. Orders were direct, but never cruel. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. It took months before the prisoners realized that no hidden authority would appear to strike them down. Psychologists from the U.S. Army, studying the prisoners' adjustment, reported that the most significant change occurred when they began to sleep through the night. Early in captivity, men woke constantly, expecting inspection or punishment. But by the third month, the camps grew quiet after lights out. The soldiers' bodies had accepted that safety was real. Their dreams shifted too. Interrogators and interpreters later noted that nightmares of battle were replaced by dreams of daily life, of eating, reading, or hearing laughter. Those dreams reflected healing. Freedom was being introduced to them not as ideology, but as lived normalcy. This subtle psychological transformation had strategic value as well. The American authorities recognized that these POWs could carry home the story of humane treatment, a weapon stronger than any propaganda leaflet. "Mercy is our best ambassador," one intelligence officer wrote. By late 1946, many prisoners openly discussed their changing views. One admitted to a chaplain, "We thought strength meant shouting. Now I see it means calm." Another confessed that the hardest adjustment would be returning home, where people still bowed from fear. The chaplain recorded his words. "He has not just lost his war, he has found his humanity." Faith redefined. Within the fences, moral boundaries blurred and expanded. Chaplains, both American and Japanese, played quiet roles in this transformation. Buddhist monks among the prisoners began small evening gatherings, chanting sutras for the dead of both sides. Nearby, Christian chaplains offered prayers for peace. Remarkably, these acts of faith were tolerated, even encouraged, by American authorities. Such openness was revolutionary for men raised under Japan's wartime state Shinto, where religion had been weaponized to sanctify obedience. Here, faith became private again, gentle, voluntary, and diverse. The men began to rediscover spirituality as comfort, not command. One Sunday at Camp McCoy, an American chaplain delivered a short message translated into Japanese. "Mercy is not surrender. It is strength that chooses not to harm." Witnesses said the prisoners listened silently, heads bowed not in submission but in reflection. Later, several carved small crosses and lotus flowers out of scrap wood and traded them among themselves, not as symbols of conversion, but of shared reverence. Through these moments, the moral foundation of the camps shifted from hierarchy to conscience. The prisoners learned that respect could exist without fear, and that forgiveness could be given even when it was undeserved. The Americans, too, learned humility, realizing that their treatment of these men was shaping the moral narrative of victory itself. Preparing minds for a new Japan education became the quiet revolution within the camps. The U.S. War Department's Civil Information and Education Section, which would later oversee Japan's reconstruction, began testing its methods on POWs. Classes in English, civics, history, and agriculture were offered to those willing to attend. Attendance was voluntary, but the rooms filled. The prisoners studied not under compulsion, but curiosity. They read translations of the U.S. Constitution, discussed democratic elections, and watched newsreels about post-war reconstruction in Europe. For many Bapar, these lessons felt like glimpses into a future they might one day help build. Red Cross observers reported something extraordinary. The Japanese POWs showed not resentment, but gratitude for the education. "They are eager to understand the civilization that defeated them," one wrote. "They do not study to resist it, but to join it." Art and craftsmanship flourished alongside study. Carved models of Japanese temples appeared beside drawings of American barns. The men were merging identities through creation, not conflict. When repatriation lists were posted, many asked to take their notebooks and English primers home, souvenirs of a transformation they couldn't yet describe. The educational programs, combined with humane discipline, achieved something no bomb could. They turned ideological enemies into potential citizens of a democratic world. As one American officer later reflected, "We did not re-educate them. We reminded them what being human looked like." By the time the camps prepared for closure, a quiet consensus had formed on both sides of the fence. The war had ended not only through surrender, but through understanding. The sight of American children laughing freely, once painful, had become a symbol of hope, a glimpse of the world that could exist when fear was no longer law. The defining moment of the Japanese prisoners' transformation did not come from speeches, lessons, or even surrender. It came from an ordinary afternoon that revealed in silence what freedom truly meant. It was late spring of 1946. The war was a fading memory now, but its ghosts still lingered in the hearts of those who had fought it. At Camp Stockton in California, the day was warm and still. The prisoners were clearing the yard, raking leaves, repairing fences, tending to the vegetable garden they had planted months earlier. The air smelled faintly of soil and pine, and for once there was no tension, No order barked, no watchful eyes of punishment. From beyond the western fence came laughter. A group of American families, wives of local workers, their children in tow, had come to visit the adjoining recreation field. They spread picnic blankets, passed sandwiches, and began tossing a baseball. The children's shouts carried easily through the open air. One boy, barefoot, chased the ball too far and stopped suddenly at the fence. On the other side stood a dozen Japanese soldiers, tools in hand, frozen in surprise. The boy waved. For a moment, no one moved. Then a guard called out lightly, "Go on, throw it back." One of the prisoners, hesitant, picked up the ball and tossed it underhand. The boy caught it, grinned, and ran back to his friends. The game resumed. It was such a small thing, so unremarkable in any other place, but within that fence it broke years of silence. The prisoners stood watching as the children played. They saw parents laughing, hands unarmed, gestures relaxed. No one barked orders, no one bowed. Even the guards, leaning against the fence, smiled faintly at the scene. Then one prisoner began to cry. It was not loud or dramatic, just a soft trembling that spread among them like wind through grass. Others followed. They covered their faces, embarrassed, but they could not stop. These were men who had faced hunger, fire, and death without flinching, but they were unprepared for this. The sight of innocence, unafraid. "I did not understand freedom until that day," one of them later said in an interview recorded by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division. It was not power, it was not victory, it was the sound of those children laughing. To the guards, the moment passed quickly, but for the prisoners it became sacred. That afternoon, as they returned to their barracks, no one spoke for a long time. In the quiet, many wrote in their diaries, small, leather-bound notebooks issued by the camp, trying to capture what they had felt. A few wrote poems, others simply drew circles, suns, or lines of waves. "The fence disappeared," one wrote, "not in the world, but in my mind." In the weeks that followed, subtle changes rippled through the camp. Men who had once refused to speak began conversing in broken English. Work details filled with laughter instead of silence. The once rigid morning salutes became more relaxed, more human. The guards noticed and reported it as improvement in morale. But it was more than morale, it was awakening. They had witnessed something profound, a society without fear, one where laughter carried farther than orders. For men raised in a system that demanded total obedience, that image was revolutionary. In Japan, one former officer confessed, children do not laugh near soldiers. Here, they run to them. The image of the boy and the baseball lingered. It traveled through letters, through stories told around campfires and barracks bunks. Each retelling carried a sense of both grief and hope, the grief of realizing what their nation had lost, and the hope that perhaps it could be rebuilt. Camp records later noted a marked change in discipline. Infractions dropped to nearly zero. Attendance at voluntary classes and religious gatherings doubled. The men had begun to police themselves, not from fear of punishment, but from a quiet desire to live up to the dignity they had been shown. For the Americans, the event was hardly worth noting. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a turning point as real as any treaty. They had discovered that freedom could exist not as an idea, but as an atmosphere, a shared air between those who trusted one another enough to laugh. When the sun set that evening, the children's voices faded, and the prisoners returned to their quarters. But the echo remained, soft, unending, and utterly transformative. That simple afternoon at Camp Stockton marked a quiet revolution within the wire. No commander announced it, no officer planned it. But from that day forward, the Japanese prisoners began to live differently. Something inside them, long buried beneath uniform and obedience, had stirred. For months they had followed routine with machine precision, morning drills, meals, work details, study sessions. Now they began to move with a subtle new ease. They spoke to one another more freely, laughed softly over shared meals, and even improvised songs while working in the gardens. It wasn't rebellion. It was rebirth. The guards noticed and reported that the prisoners were displaying spontaneous good humor, an observation as rare as it was telling. The change wasn't confined to behavior, it was philosophical. The sight of free children had sparked the most dangerous question a soldier could ask. What was all this for? For years they had fought for an empire that claimed moral superiority through sacrifice and silence. Yet in defeat, they had found a peace that their empire could never give them. It was an unbearable paradox, one that dissolved hatred faster than any sermon could. A former naval officer later explained it this way in an oral history interview. We had been told that America was a land of chaos, but there, through the fence, I saw that freedom has its own order. The children were not afraid, yet they obeyed the rhythm of the game. That was when I understood. Discipline without fear is possible. Inside the barracks, conversations deepened. The prisoners began sharing memories of their own children, how they had last seen them, what they hoped they might be doing now. One man spoke of his daughter in Nagasaki, who used to fold paper cranes for luck. He said the laughter of the American children reminded him of her voice. That night he carved a small crane from a scrap of pine and hung it by his bunk. Soon others began carving as well: boats, birds, suns, even a baseball. These small creations spread like offerings, tokens of a new understanding. When guards discovered them, they didn't confiscate them. Instead, some accepted the carvings as gifts. The act of giving across the fence became a wordless acknowledgement that something profound had passed between the two sides. As summer advanced, the camp command allowed limited open recreation events. A baseball game was organized between the guards and a group of English-speaking prisoners who had been studying American customs. It was a modest, symbolic affair, but the field that day was lined with laughter, not mockery or triumph, just shared amusement. A photograph taken during the event shows two teams smiling under the same flag, sunlight sharp on their faces. One of the Japanese players, years later, said, "We were still prisoners, but for that hour, we were only men." That was the essence of the transformation, the realization that humanity could exist without hierarchy. Freedom was not an enemy's trick or luxury. It was a shared responsibility, a fragile order maintained by mutual respect. When the Red Cross visited again in September 1946, they reported that morale among the Japanese POWs was extraordinarily high. Illnesses declined, discipline issues vanished entirely. The inspectors noted that prisoners display optimism regarding post-war peace and return to Japan. What the report could not capture was the emotional truth, that the men had learned to hope again. At evening roll call one day, a sergeant who had once been feared for his severity broke formation to thank the American officer in charge. Through the interpreter he said, "You have shown us that honor can survive defeat." The officer, surprised, could only nod. The camp would close soon after. The war had ended, and ships were being prepared for repatriation. As the prisoners packed their belongings, uniforms, notebooks, carvings, they carried more than possessions. They carried a redefinition of strength. For those men, freedom was no longer an abstract word. It had a face, a sound, a smell, the laughter of children, the softness of soil, the taste of milk. They had once believed freedom was weakness. Now they understood it as grace. And in that understanding, the war, at least for them, finally ended. By the spring of 1947, the camps began to empty. The war had been over for nearly 2 years, but the journey home for Japanese prisoners was slow, deliberate, and filled with quiet emotion. Repatriation orders arrived with lists typed neatly on onion skin paper. Each name read aloud marked the end of captivity and the beginning of an uncertain return. At Camp Stockton, farewells were subdued. The Americans assembled transport trucks and provided each man with new uniforms marked POW in small letters, a Red Cross care package, and a final medical check. Many of the prisoners, now heavier, healthier, and visibly older than when they'd arrived, bowed deeply to the guards who had once represented the enemy. Some guards saluted back, others simply extended a hand. The gestures, awkward but sincere, carried a weight that no translation could explain. For the men boarding the trains to San Francisco, there was relief but also hesitation. They were leaving the land that had defeated them, but had also, in its quiet mercy, restored their dignity. The countryside outside the windows rolled by in endless golden green, dotted with small towns, playgrounds, and waving children. For some, it was their final glimpse of America, the nation that had taught them freedom not through lectures, but through example. When they reached the ports, ships waited under gray skies, flying both the stars and stripes and the Red Cross emblem. The journey across the Pacific was somber. The men gathered on deck, staring toward the horizon. Few spoke. One former officer wrote in his diary, "I have lived in 2 Japans, the one I left and the one I must now rebuild. Between them lies a fence, and on the other side, laughter." The return home was far harsher than they imagined. Japan was unrecognizable. Cities were ruins. Food was scarce. Families had scattered. Many of the repatriated soldiers arrived to find that wives and parents had assumed them dead. Others discovered entire neighborhoods flattened, temples reduced to ash. The discipline that had once defined them offered little guidance in this new world. Yet among them, something had changed. Reports collected by the Allied occupation authorities in late 1947 noted a distinct pattern. Former POWs from U.S. camps were calmer, more cooperative, and more open to reform than those returning from other theaters. They spoke with respect for their captors, often describing Americans as strong without cruelty. These men became, in subtle ways, bridges between nations. They translated for occupation forces, helped rebuild local schools, and taught English to curious neighbors. Some began informal discussion circles where they recounted what they had seen in America: women voting, children laughing, workers speaking freely. Their stories spread quietly through towns still cloaked in defeat. To a people struggling to understand democracy, those testimonies became seeds of comprehension. One former sergeant interviewed in 1951 said, "I learned freedom from the sound of laughter. It was not noise, it was the sound of safety. We had lived too long in silence." Another, who had lost his entire family in Nagasaki, spent his later years teaching children at a rural school. When asked why, he answered simply, "Because once the children of my enemy taught me peace." Their captivity had become their redemption. They had been broken by war and remade by kindness, proof that even in victory, mercy could be the greater weapon. When the last of the Japanese POWs stepped back onto their homeland, they carried with them an invisible inheritance, one born not of victory or defeat, but of understanding. For many, that understanding became the compass by which they rebuilt their lives. The Japan they returned to was hollowed and hungry. Tokyo was a skeleton of steel and ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were silent craters of memory. Food was scarce, tempers thin. The returning prisoners, healthier than those who had endured the bombings or fought to the end, were met with suspicion. Some civilians viewed them as cowards for surrendering. Others, haunted by propaganda, whispered that they had been Americanized. To survive such scorn required quiet strength, the same calm discipline they had learned under American watchtowers. Many of them refused to argue. They simply worked. They built homes, repaired roads, and taught children. What they had learned in the camps, trust, fairness, and respect, slowly seeped into post-war Japan's veins. Several became teachers, journalists, or local officials in rural communities. Their memories of America's civility became lessons for the next generation. "I learned democracy from a guard who shared his lunch," one man told a reporter in 1954. He didn't know he was teaching. Others joined new peace movements that emerged during Japan's Reconstruction. They spoke at schools about the futility of blind obedience and the dignity of compassion. "We discovered too late," one former lieutenant said, "that mercy can be stronger than discipline." Those words, spoken without bitterness, resonated in a country eager to rebuild its moral foundations. Historians later recognized this quiet influence. Post-war surveys by the Japanese Ministry of Education found that many ex-POWs from U.S. camps became advocates for international understanding. They translated American books, taught English, and even corresponded with their former guards. A few returned to the United States years later, not as prisoners, but as guests. They visited the same communities where they had once labored, carrying small gifts, fans, calligraphy, carved cranes, as tokens of gratitude. One reunion, held in 1961 on a California farm, was captured in a faded black and white photograph. An American farmer, gray-haired now, shaking hands with a man who had once stood on the other side of his fence. Between them stood the farmer's son, the boy who had once lost his baseball beyond the wire. Both men smiled, eyes wet. "He was the first free child I ever saw," the Japanese visitor said softly. Their friendship, like hundreds of others born from those camps, outlived governments and flags. It stood as a quiet monument to what mercy can accomplish when hate exhausts itself. By the 1970s, most of the former POWs had passed into old age. Their diaries, carefully kept and later donated to museums, testify to their transformation. In them, the word freedom appears again and again, not as a political term, but as a feeling. Warmth, safety, laughter. One entry reads simply, "I knew I was free the day I stopped fearing the sound of children. The camps that once held them have long vanished, their fences dismantled, their fields returned to ordinary life. Yet their legacy endures quietly in the moral DNA of both nations. America proved that victory need not demand cruelty. Japan proved that even after ruin, grace could be learned. And at the heart of that exchange, across oceans, across history, remains a single image: weary soldiers standing behind a fence, watching a baseball arc through sunlight as children laugh without fear." In that moment, the war ended, not by treaty, but by understanding. History remembers nations by their battles, but humanity is remembered by its mercies. The story of the Japanese prisoners who wept while watching American children play is not one of conquest or humiliation. It is the rediscovery of what civilization looks like when hatred is no longer in charge. Behind fences meant to divide enemies, the simplest of sounds became a bridge, the laughter of children, clear and unafraid. To the men who had been taught that discipline and silence were virtues, that laughter became revelation. They saw in it a strength their empire had never known, a power that needed no weapons, no orders, no fear. In that moment they realized that freedom was not chaos, but trust. For the Americans, the lesson was quieter, but just as profound. By feeding and protecting the men who had once sworn to destroy them, they proved that victory could be noble. Compassion, extended without demand, became the truest display of power. It showed that peace begins not when war ends, but when empathy crosses the line between self and enemy. In the decades that followed, Those brief encounters of guards and prisoners, of laughter and tears, became invisible threads connecting two former adversaries. They helped forge the unlikeliest of alliances, turning war's aftermath into partnership. The fences are gone now, the camps are empty, but the echo remains, the sound of children's voices carried across sunlight and wire, softening even the hardest of hearts. That echo is what endures in history's quieter pages. Proof that humanity, even when divided by language, flag, or pain, recognizes itself in innocence. And perhaps that is the true definition of freedom, not a political condition, but a moral one. It is the space where fear no longer commands behavior and compassion no longer asks permission to exist.